because she is not free. And we all know how important freedom is. He argues that Africa needs to advocate for specific ways to address the abuses of the past and the present. Specifically, Mr. Ayittey calls for democratic government, debt re-examination, modernized infrastructure, free market economics, and free trade to promote development. Ayittey holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the University of Ghana, a master's degree from the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and a PhD from the University of Manitoba. In 2008, Dr. Ayittey was listed by Foreign Policy, which I know that I read religiously, as one of the top 100 public intellectuals who are shaping the tenor of our time. Personally, as an international relations student, I have benefited so much from his scholarship. On behalf of SFL and the global student movement for liberty, we are so honored to welcome him tonight. Please join me in welcoming him with a warm round of applause. And on behalf of SFL, I present Mr. Ayittey with our Alumnus of the Year Award.
Well, thank you so much for the award, and also for making me an Alumnus of the Year Award from Students for Liberty. And I also would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you, and also to come in to listen to me. And the topic of my address is advancing liberty. And I'm afraid I don't have some good news to tell you. I don't know whether you looked at Freedom House's 2014 report about freedom in the world. Now, it states that for the 8th consecutive year, freedom in the world has declined. Now, it's really sad news. Either the dictators are getting smarter and learning new ways and tricks to beat back the democratic challenge, or we have not been effective in confronting these dictators. Now, if you look at Africa, for example, it's a continent of 55 countries, but only 13 of them are democratic. 13 out of 55 African countries. Now, which means that the vast majority of the African people still live under tyranny and oppression, okay? And that was one of the main reasons why Africa is so poor, because she's not free. Now, how do we advance the cause of liberty? Now, I'd like to share with you my own personal experience. I'm sure that some of you may also have some ideas which you may want to share with us later on. Now, there have been some obstacles. And there have been 6 obstacles, and I'd like to identify some of them. The first one is that we need to be aware of the limitations of cultural resonance when we use the term liberty. I hate to get myself embroiled in an argument with a Frenchman about liberty. Although the word liberty, is run from the French word liberté. But you see, the French have a different conception of liberty, or the state. See, I believe that the more power the state has, the less free its people, or its citizens. Now, if you look at the French Revolution and the American Revolution, both, were championing liberty, but the French have a different conception of the state. See, Americans believe that, the state is necessarily evil. So they drew up a constitution, they wrote up a constitution which limits the power of the state, and to protect its people against their inalienable rights. The French, on the other hand, have a different conception. The Arab Revolution originated from the French Revolution, which was against Louis XVI, whose brother famously quipped that l'état c'est moi, which means the state is mine. And the French people said, no, it's not yours, the state is ours. So the French, you see, are comfortable with a more powerful, a more paternalistic, a more interventionist state, which serves as a protector and a guarantor of individual liberties. You see, this was the legacy they bequeathed to their colonies in Africa, and which explains the reasons why most of the countries in Africa which have been in turmoil recently have been ex-French colonies. Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Burundi, Rwanda, Congo, Ivory Coast. Most of them are French colonies. You may also want to add Guinea and Madagascar. Okay? So we have to be careful when we use the term liberty. Okay? Like I said, I don't want to argue with a Frenchman about the term liberty. But you see, in our part of the world, the term freedom resonates more with the people, because in those parts of the region, we've been dealing with oppression of groups of people. So there, it's more realistic, and it sounds well to talk about freedom from oppression. Now, if we want to use the word freedom, then which type of freedom do we mean? There is intellectual freedom, there is political freedom, there is economic freedom. Which one should we promote first? And I'd like you to think about this as I continue with my speech. The second obstacle that I have encountered, that I have found, is that there are Americans, white Americans, who do not want to criticize black African leaders for fear of being called racist. And there are also African Americans who do not want to criticize black African dictators because they feel that they are obligated to show racial solidarity with such dictators. Now, when this happens, if everybody keeps quiet about African dictators, of course, who gets hurt? It's the people who gets hurt. It's always important, one of the ways by which we can get around this particular hangout is to distinguish between the African people and the African leaders. The two are not synonymous. The leaders have been the problem, not the people. It is true, you can say that, all right, look, the leaders come from the same stock of people. But the statement that the people deserve the leaders that they get is not accurate in many African countries. The reason why it is not accurate, that statement will be true if and only if the people participate in the process of choosing their leaders. But that is not the case in many African countries, where you have military officers seize power and impose themselves on their people. And then even when the people participate in choosing their leaders, elections are rigged in Africa, and votes have been nullified. So it is important always to distinguish between the African leaders and African people. You may not like Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. I think he's a coconut. But that doesn't mean that you hate Zimbabweans or you hate black African people. Always make that particular distinction. Now, the third obstacle that we've always had has been the West itself. Now, if you look at the West, there are so many NGOs, so many groups, so many organizations which are promoting one aspect of freedom in the third world. But you see, there is very little coordination among them. And quite often they work at cross purposes to each other. And that can be very, very confusing and frustrating because you don't know exactly what they're promoting. Well, I have to grant you this. Some of these, NGOs, Western NGOs, they do a remarkable job. And, they're also operating under severe constraints because if they criticize the home government, they'll be kicked out of the country, so they have to be extremely careful. But still, the message is very, very confusing. Now, the second obstacle, the second problem with the West itself is that quite too often, the West allows its security interests, its political interests, and geopolitical interests to trump the campaign for democracy. Now, this was quite evident during the Cold War. It seemed that during the Cold War, any buffoon who came to the Western capital and professed himself to be anti-communist suddenly unlocked the floodgates of Western aid. Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire was one of them. Ferdinand Marcos of Philippines was another one of them. Suharto was another one of them. And guess what they did? They got tons and tons of Western aid and they skimmed the top of that for their own pockets. Mobutu, for example, amassed a personal fortune of $10 billion. Marcos, $12 billion. Now, after the Cold War, there was supposed to be some recalibration, but it became business as usual. When President Bush, former President George Bush, announced a war against terrorism, guess what happened? All sorts of rogue regimes and other ones all of a sudden emerged, claimed that they were fighting against terrorism in order to receive US aid. Charles Taylor of Liberia even set up an anti-terrorism unit run by his own son. Mugabe claimed he was fighting against terrorism. Even the warlords of Mogadishu, who have been terrorizing citizens and residents of Mogadishu, formed themselves into a coalition against terrorism and received $6 million in funding from the CIA. Now, look at the current allies against terrorism. Now, the point which I want to emphasize is that the West too often allowed itself to be blindsided by its own rhetoric, which is why quite often it finds itself on the wrong side of the People's Revolution in many countries. It was on the wrong side in the Philippines 1986 revolution, wrong side in Indonesia 1979 revolution. Even if you come forward, when the Arab Spring erupted, the West was caught completely flat-footed. It didn't know how to respond. Even today, massive confusion still reigns about who is the dictator. Well, he's not a dictator if he has oil. He's not a dictator if he's an ally on a war against terrorism. He's not a dictator if he allows the US to establish bases to transport supplies to troops in Afghanistan, like Uzbekistan. He's not a dictator if he shaves his beard 3 times a week. Look, cut out that crap. A dictator is a dictator is a dictator. There's no such thing. Look, there's no such thing as a benevolent dictator. The only good dictator is a dead one. Now, the fourth obstacle that we have encountered, and this is even bigger, is the opposition itself. In many of these African countries, parts in the third world. Look, for every force in nature, there is a counterforce. A force dominates if a counterforce is non-existent or weak. Now, dictators have proliferated because the counterforce, the opposition in many countries, is hopeless and non-existent. It pains me to say this, but in too many countries, the opposition is weak, fragmented, squabbling among themselves. They are susceptible to bribery and corruption, and sometimes their choice of tactics is so poor. Let me give you an example. Look at Ethiopia. Okay? The opposition groups, they can't even unite against a common enemy. There are 112 political parties in Ethiopia. 112 political parties. Look at Zimbabwe. The opposition finally came together. But then, 4 months before the 2008 elections, the NDC itself split. Shall I mention the opposition in Syria? Which one do we support to advance democracy? Now, you see, quite often, too many times, the opposition leaders are themselves closet dictators, exhibiting the same tyrannical tendencies that they loudly condemn in the despots they want to replace. So we need sometimes also, I don't want to use the word train, but also we need to focus on the opposition to get them at least to unite against a common enemy. The fourth obstacle that I have encountered relates to, and this is something that we always need to avoid, and that is cultural imperialism. I have met Westerners in Africa who think, they exude this arrogant, we know best attitude that, we're going to Africa, we're going to teach Africans about freedom and so forth. But you see, the thing is, Africans themselves know what their problem is. They see their governments as a problem. As a matter of fact, here's what one Lesotho chief, a traditional chief, said. He said, here in Lesotho we got two problems: rats and the government. It's not difficult to persuade Africans. Look, if you look across Africa, their governments are corrupt, incompetent, dysfunctional. There are only three things African governments know how to do very, very well. The first one is to loot the treasury. The second is to rig and steal elections to remain in power. And the fourth and the third is to squelch all opposition. Ask them about providing basic social services like clean water, education, healthcare. Forget it. Africans themselves know this. So we should not try and go to Africa and try and preach to Africans, lecture to Africans, rise up against their government. They themselves already know what's hurting them. The sixth obstacle that I've also encountered is that sometimes, when we're preaching a message of liberty, we have to couch it in cultural terms to make it more acceptable or readily understandable by the people. I very, very rarely quote Alexander Hamilton in my writings, or Thomas Jefferson in my writings, or Adam Smith. Not that they're great thinkers and leaders, but they're not culturally relevant in that particular context in which I want to use it. If I want to talk about, I don't even want to use the term capitalism. I would prefer free markets. And even free markets, I wouldn't give you an example of a free market unless if I want to, I tell Africans to look at their own village markets. Their own village markets have been there for centuries. Their own village markets have always been free. Chiefs don't fix prices on village markets. There are no restraints on village. Anybody can go up and set up shop in an African village market. So in other words, when you use this kind of cultural medium to address Africans, they can resonate, they can relate more to such things. So it is important. The same thing with when it comes to government. As a matter of fact, African conception of the state is very, very similar to Americans. Africans also believe that the state is evil. Now, as a matter of fact, if you want the most radical form of, thinking about liberty, there are some African groups who believe that, look, since the state is potentially evil, to protect themselves against such an evil, these people are elected not to have any leader at all. They are called stateless societies. And examples of such stateless societies are the Igbo. The Igbos have an expression, and that expression is Izibuelo. Izibuelo means that the king is an enemy. Another example is the Somali. The Somali dismiss government as Wazan. Wazan means the thing. Now, if you look at Somalia, right now Somalia is in chaos. And a lot of people will think that, well, Somalia is in chaos because the people don't know how to establish democracy. No, they don't want government. Anybody who imposes government on them, they fought the colonial Wazan. And they fought, the elite Wazan imposed upon them after independence. And they are fighting an Islamic Wazan. That is the way the Somalis are born free. See, if you don't understand them, see, it is important to understand these people before we create something and impose upon them that they do not want. Another example of stateless society is the Gikuyu, the thief, for example. Now, then there are those ethnic groups who believe that, okay, look, we can't get rid of the state, it's a necessary evil, but if we have a leader, we have to tie him down, we have to hand him down with councils upon councils upon councils to prevent him from abusing his power. The chief, for example, must rule with a council of elders. Without a council of elders, the chief is powerless. Now, if you have a bad chief, the council of elders can remove him. If the council of elders doesn't, then the people simply abandon the chief. They will vote with their feet and go and settle somewhere else. So a tyrannical chief all of a sudden finds himself without any people. Now, but then contrast this to modern Africa. In modern Africa, we can't remove our bad leaders. They stay in office 10, 20, 30, 40 years. They consider their presidency to be their family property. So they groom their sons, their wives, cats, dogs, and even goats to succeed them. In many African countries, we can't remove our leaders, we can't change our leaders without destroying the country. This is a problem that we face in Africa. Now, so we have had 6 obstacles. The first one is, the cultural resonance of the term liberty. And then we've had political correctness, and also the West itself confuses the whole issue. And we have the opposition, which we have to strengthen, and then we have, we have to be careful about cultural imperialism, and also we have to deliver the message in a cultural medium in which the people can understand. Now, when it comes to the experience that we have found, when it comes to establishing a free society, it takes 2 steps. One of the things that we have learned is that, look, dictators are allergic to reform. The West has spent billions and billions and billions of dollars trying to persuade, cajole, and even bribe these dictators to reform their abominable economic and political systems. Guess what happens? The dictators take the money and then they do the coconut boogie. 1 step forward, 3 steps back, and a flip to land on a fat Swiss bank account. Much ado about nothing. Enough. Okay. These dictators are not serious about reform. Ask them to cut government spending and they will set up a ministry of less government spending. This is what Mali did. Ask them to practice good governance and Tanzania set up a ministry of good governance. Ask them to develop their economies and they will develop their pocket. Ask them to seek foreign investment, and they will seek a foreign country to invest their loot. This is what has been going on. But you see, the thing is, the first step in establishing a free society is to get rid of these dictators. That's the first step. Now, how do we do that? Now, it takes the first thing that we need to know is that rah, noisy, street demonstrations. Mugabe must go, Mugabe must go. It's not the